I'm really excited to have you listen. The number one country that I get asked about for moving abroad is Canada from the American clients that I work with. Everyone is interested. It's the hot button topic. I think most of you know me, but for those of you who don't, my name is Jess Drucker. I'm an LGBTQ international relocation strategist. I'm also the founder of Adventure Calls Media and Consulting. Basically, I help queer folks move, live, and thrive abroad. And I thought it best, rather than me giving my best possible help in telling people who can or can't move to Canada, rather than that coming from me, I thought you needed to hear it from the people who actually know about Canadian immigration. And so today we're talking to Toronto-based immigration law firm Long Mangoji. We've got Elizabeth Long and Adel Mangoji on today's call. They're basically going to lead this whole thing and tell you all the answers. Elizabeth, are they able to pop questions into the Q&A?
Absolutely. So on the bottom there, you'll find your Q&A button. And just feel free to put in your questions throughout this. We'll answer your questions at the end of the presentation. And we'll try to get through everyone's, but if we run out of time, we'll just do whoever pops their questions first. First come, first serve.
Yeah, no, and thank you so much for doing this, really, to both of you. This is so important for so many people. I think a lot of people think because of the proximity to the US, because of the proximity of the language in the US, that they must be able to move to Canada, and they start their planning. And then a lot of my job is to be a dream crusher. And I hate being a dream crusher, and I don't want to be a dream crusher anymore. And so let's get all the facts. How and who can move to Canada, and how can they do it? So I hand it over to you, and take it away.
Thanks so much, Jessica.
Yeah.
I mean, we are not here to be dream crushers. We're here to be dream makers. That being said, you don't just get to go to sleep and come to Canada. There are things to do if you want to come. So let's get started.
Okay, thanks everybody. So I'm going to be starting the presentation. Essentially, I'm going to be talking a little bit about living in Canada as a queer individual. I identify as gay myself, and so we thought it would be best that I start with speaking about this topic. And then I'm going to be going through family sponsorships, which is one major way that we see Americans coming. And then Elizabeth is going to be focusing on some of the economic options that are available both in permanent and temporary residence. I think what's really important, and I'm glad that we talked about this right off the bat, is Canada has become a hot country for Americans. I've started telling my American clients, about 5 or 10 years ago when I first started kind of doing this, America might have been like the 4th or 5th country of reference for us. And, it has in the more recent years, because a lot of political turmoil that's happening has kind of really jumped to the top of our reference, our list of countries that people are coming in from. And so, and especially amongst queer individuals as things, their security starts to become questioned overseas. Many people have kind of really looked at Canada as a space where it's safe to raise children, kind of with queer values and queer ideologies within Canada. So living in Canada is actually very great as a queer individual. We, especially in the big cities, we have big communities, and we have major pride events, but I think more importantly it's also a very safe place to raise queer families. Almost all the schools do have queer families within it, and children tend to feel really comfortable in Canada. And so I always kind of mention this as when people are coming to Canada as a very strong point. And a lot of it is families that are coming here is what we're finding. And family sponsorships have become a huge way in which people are coming. Liz, do you just want to move the slide? And so basically we are going to be talking about family sponsorships, and we're going to be talking about economic possibilities also. What we've been finding, we're just going to the next slide. What we've been finding in terms of families is there was a lot of people in terms of sponsorships that have Canadians who have gone abroad to the United States. For years and years in Canada, this was kind of called the brain drain to the United States, and that we lost a lot of individuals there, and they got married and they started families. However, what we began to see now is what we call the very reverse, or people even coming here for short periods of time or even longer periods of time. And a lot of them have a Canadian citizen or Canadian permanent resident within the family. And so spousal sponsorships have become a real option for individuals. Spousal sponsorship applications are very interesting. And the reason being is usually in the United States and other places, the marriage is only recognized if you're married. And for a lot of queer individuals, either they choose not to be married, or they choose because of many historical and political reasons, but also they may come from countries where there isn't gay marriage, or they have a partner and they couldn't get into the United States, so they couldn't be married that way. So basically, one area that we have that is always really interesting to my American clients is we have something that's called the common law relationship in Canada, which doesn't exist in the United States. And the common law relationship is essentially you don't have to be legally married, and you don't actually have to have the government assess your relationship in any way. Basically, it's any individuals who have lived together for at least 1 year continuously in a marital-like relationship would be considered common law. And this is really interesting and important because once you are common law, you can be sponsored to Canada. So if you've lived together with a Canadian citizen spouse for over 1 year, your guys' relationship would be considered common law, and they would be able to sponsor you to come to Canada. A lot of people say, well, we used to live together for 1 year, but then for work, we had to live apart for a while. And has that broken our common law relationship? And the answer is no. As long as you've lived together for at least 1 year, and then you've kind of gone separate ways, either people have gone to school or worked, as long as you've maintained your relationship, you maintain that common law status. So just separating doesn't mean all of a sudden that you've lost that status. So as long as you kind of stayed in a relationship, you're still common law, according to the Canadian government. So this basically is a really important area in which people don't really realize that they can be sponsored to Canada through their partner. Okay, so if you are either common law or you are in a marital relationship, your partner can sponsor you to come to Canada, and we can do it in one of two ways. Either we do it overseas, which means we file the application while you're still in the United States, or for Americans, we often will do an in-Canada application. Okay, so I'm going to first talk about the overseas, and then I'll talk about the in-Canada, and we'll go through some of the differences between both of these. So the overseas application, the way that it envisions it is that you apply for permanent residency, you continue living in your home country, so the United States, and then once you get permanent residency, you come to Canada. Okay. This is often for people who come to me and say, you know what, although I want to move in a year, or I want to move in a year and a half, and I'm just trying to plan, but I'm still working in the United States, and that's when we plan to go there. This is an option for you if your Canadian partner is a citizen of Canada. So citizens are allowed to sponsor individuals from overseas, so they can be in the United States while they're doing the sponsorship, but they do have to show what we call intent to return. So that means that they need to show documents that say that they're going to be returning to Canada, once the person does get permanent residence. If your sponsor is a permanent resident, though, they cannot sponsor you from overseas. Basically, the permanent resident has to be in Canada, and then they can sponsor you to come to Canada, and they have to be living in Canada while the application is in process. So it can mean some time of separation for the couple. However, that doesn't mean that you can't come visit them in Canada while you're waiting for the application to process. And essentially, it's very, many of you, as you know, it's very easy to come in as a visitor, and you're allowed to come in as a visitor during that time period. Overseas applications right now, we're seeing about a 1-year processing time. Some of them tend to be a lot faster. The overseas visa posts in the States tend to be some of the fastest in the world. The last couple I've gotten back, between eight months to a year. So we're very happy with those processing times. Okay. The In Canada, that's the application that we use for individuals that say, you know what, I want to move now, or I want to move as fast as possible to Canada. These are people that basically are looking to make a change very quickly. The way that this would work is your Canadian partner and you would move to Canada. And as long as you are legally in Canada, so what that often means is the Americans will come in as a visitor. They're allowed to stay for 6 months. So as long as we put in a spousal sponsorship application in those 6 months, then you're allowed to stay in Canada while the application is being processed. But it kind of also means that you're stuck in Canada while the application is being processed, because one of the requirements for an in Canada sponsorship is that you live together in Canada while the application is being processed. Okay, so the overseas gives you flexibility. What the in Canada gives you is, if once you apply, you can also apply for a work permit with it. And so within about 4 to 6 months, you'll receive a work permit, and you can be working in Canada while you're waiting for that application to be processed. So it's a really nice perk that's given as part of the inland application, because you can kind of start your life in Canada while you're waiting for the processing. So, and basically also for the in Canada, we're seeing about a 1-year processing time, just a bit shorter is what's happening right now. But usually I tell people to plan for a year. So the overseas is for people who want the flexibility, who have some time before they're coming to Canada. The in Canada is for individuals that want to come pretty much as soon as possible, but there's a bit less flexibility in that you have to be living in Canada while that application is in process. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Ado, I was on mute. I just wanted to discuss something. So when we're talking about legally in Canada, we're talking about it in relation to your ability to apply for work permit. There is a possibility if someone doesn't have legal status to apply for in Canada application, right?
Yeah, so if somebody is undocumented in Canada or their legal status has expired, they can still apply for an in Canada. You technically don't meet the requirements, and you do have to ask for a humanitarian and compassionate exemption from the fact that you are not in Canada legally, but it is quite common in a way, and it's a very common way to regularize people's status within the country.
Mm-hmm. You just don't get the work permit.
You don't get the work permit, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. So now before I go into all of the economic stuff, just wanted to turn back and just to make sure we're all on the same page, talk about different kinds of status that you can have in Canada. A lot of you will already understand this, but just just to make sure we're all on the same page. So there's 3 kinds of immigration status where you are legally in Canada. The temporary residence is where you're a visitor, you're a worker, you're a student. This allows you to be in Canada, but only for a certain amount of time, and you are restricted as to what you can do. So as a visitor, you are able to be in Canada. Normally, each time you enter Canada, the default is 6 months, unless the officer at the border tells you otherwise. Every time you leave and you come back, you get another 6 months. But you don't have to leave. You can always file an extension within Canada and extend your stay for that period, for a certain period of time that you're requesting the officer to provide that to you. And in fact, as long as you file the extension before your status expires, you get to stay in Canada. Your status extends, and it's called implied status or maintained status, and you get to stay until a decision is made. And oftentimes right now it takes 6-7 months to get a decision, so you kind of get a free 6 months for sure, or however long it takes for the officer to get to your application. As a visitor, you're not allowed to work for a company in Canada. You're not allowed to work for yourself or anything that would impact the labor market in Canada. However, if you're working for a company in the States that has nothing to do with Canada, and there's no it doesn't gain any economic benefit from, for example, they don't have clients in Canada that you're working for, they don't have any interest in Canada, then that is actually not counted as work. So you could remote work in Canada as a visitor in those kinds of circumstances. But a lot of times, especially when we're going to talk about economic permanent residence, it will be worth your while to get a work permit. We're going to talk about that because oftentimes, if you're not able to be sponsored because you're not lucky enough to be married to Canadian, okay, who can be sponsored, that's okay. There's a lot of other ways to also come, and we'll talk about that. The other thing is students. So sometimes if you can't get a work permit right away because you don't have a job offer right away, it's probably worth your while to study in Canada, and then you'll get an open work permit when you graduate, and then it's much easier to find work and then be on your way to getting permanent residence. Okay. Now, permanent residence is what you guys call a green card in the States. Permanent residence, you're allowed to stay for as long as you want. In fact, there is a requirement that to keep your permanent residence, you are in Canada 2 out of 5 years. There are 2 exceptions to the rule. One is that you are married to a Canadian citizen and you accompany, or common law as well, and you're accompanying your spouse outside of Canada, that time is counted towards residence in Canada. The other one is if you're working for a Canadian company and that Canadian company sends you to do some work outside of Canada, that time is also counted towards your residence requirement in Canada. But in general, the rule is 2 out of 5 years to keep your permanent residence. Other than that, permanent residents are almost the same as citizens, except you can't vote. And then moving on to citizenship, you get your citizenship if you have resided in Canada 3 out of 5 years, and 2 of those years have to be after you become a permanent resident. 1 year, you can get credit for when you're a temporary resident, but that's counted as half time. So if you've been in Canada for 2 years before you get permanent residence, you get 1 year credit. If you were in Canada for 1 year, you get 6 months credit. All right, let's then talk about economic. So there are a lot of programs for permanent residents, and we'll run through some of the more common ones, at least here in Ontario. So the federal programs, they're express entry, and we'll talk about that, okay? Startup visas for entrepreneurs. There are other programs, Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot, Atlantic Immigration Programs. These are more area based. There's something for self-employed artists and athletes. There's a Hong Kong program. There is caregiver program. Okay, so these are the most of the programs that are federally based. So immigration, IRCC is a federal jurisdiction, a federal government. But the federal government has also made an agreement with each province to allow each province to have their own immigration programs, their own selection criteria, and those are called provincial nominee programs. Okay, and so we won't be able to cover all the provinces today, I would talk about some of the Ontario's programs to give you a sense of what the provincial nominee programs are all about. The provincial nominee programs, the provinces there have an interest to select people who want to live in their province. Now, it doesn't mean that if you go through a provincial nominee program, you have to stay in that province forever. You have to show that you intend to live in that province. But if after you get your permanent residence, your intent changes, then your intent changes, and that's okay. However, if you don't have permanent residence yet and you move to another province, then that could be an issue. Quebec is on its own program. Quebec, it's the only province where its programs, if you want to go through Express Entry or any of these programs for the federal government, you cannot say that you intend to live in Quebec. Because if you do, then you're not allowed to immigrate through any of these programs for the federal program. If you want to go to Quebec, you have to immigrate through the Quebec program. Now, the Quebec programs, they really emphasize a person's ability to speak French, and B, they can be quite long in processing. For example, Express Entry, you can, get permanent residence in 6 months for processing time if you get invited to apply. Quebec, it can be upwards of around 3 years. Okay. All right. So I'm going to go through a few sort of pathways that different people, depending on circumstances, may be able to immigrate to Canada. So one of the pathways, for example, is if you're a professional worker or even in the trades, etc. What do? Well, we apply for a work permit, you work in Canada, and then afterwards you're much more likely to be able to qualify to or be selected to be invited to apply for one of the PR categories. Similarly for students. So for students, if you study in a public university or college, okay, when we say college, we're talking more about community colleges, but they still have to be publicly run, okay? If you're studying in a public university or college, when you graduate, you can get a work permit, which is an open work permit, which means you can work for anyone you like in Canada. And this is called a post-graduation work permit. So if you study in a 1-year program, you get a 1-year post-grad work permit. If you study in a 2-year program, you get a 3-year post-grad work permit. And then you can find a job much more easily and then apply then for permanent residence. For entrepreneurs, what we often have do is if say you want to run a business in Canada, you have your business in the States, want to come to Canada, there are different ways to get a work permit. There's something, for example, called an intra-company transferee work permit, where we create a subsidiary or related business in Canada, and your business is continuing to run in the States, and we transfer you to come to Canada to work. Or if you're planning to start a brand new business and you don't plan to continue your business in the States, then we could apply for something called an entrepreneur work permit. And then once we get that work permit, you're going to come into Canada, you manage the business for around a year or so, then you'll have around 200 points added to your Express Entry application. And you could then apply under that category. There's a few other categories for entrepreneurs as well. But essentially this is the plan. Okay. All right. Let's start talking about Express Entry. It's one of the most popular and most well-known programs for Canada. And many of you might already know about it. Let me just sort of put it to you in sort of do a broad overview of it. So what happens with Express Entry is in order to go through it, first you have to create an online profile. And you qualify by qualifying under one of 3 programs: Federal Skilled Worker Program, Canadian Experience class, and the Federal Skilled Trades. Once you qualify, you can enter the express entry pool. Now, just because you entered the pool does not mean that you have applied for permanent residence. This is really important because I have a lot of people coming to me and say, oh, yeah, I applied for permanent residence through express entry. I said, oh, really? Are you still in the pool or did you get invited to apply? Oh, I'm still in the pool. That doesn't mean that you've applied. The government does not consider this applying. You're just a candidate. You haven't done anything yet because once you enter the pool, you'll get a series of points based on your background and if you have provincial nomination. And every couple of weeks, the government has a draw where they issue an invitation to apply. Now, if you receive this invitation to apply, then you can actually submit your application. But if you don't receive an invitation to apply, you just stay in the pool. After 1 year, your profile expires, and then you're just out. Okay, so just because you're entering in the pool, that doesn't mean much. We have to see if you can actually get an invitation to apply. Otherwise, you're just in there for a year, and that's it. Okay. So let's talk about first how to get into the pool, and then we're going to talk about your points to get out. So in order to get into the pool, a lot of people can get in, even if you have no work experience in Canada, no ties to Canada, still possible. This is a very, very old program. It's been around for decades. It's had a lot of changes, but essentially the Federal Skilled Worker Program is a points system. Now the points for this is very different from the points for express entry. Essentially, it's a pass mark of 67. We look at your work experience. You have to have at least 1 year of high-skilled, full-time work experience in one occupation for at least 1 year that's continuous, okay? And then afterwards, we'll take a look at your background and see if you meet the minimum score. Most of you, if you have a degree, relatively young and have a high-skilled work experience, can probably qualify to get into the pool. But remember, just because you can get into the pool under this category doesn't mean you can get an invitation to apply. So right now, pre-COVID, and starting from July of this year, the government has been inviting everybody who gets into the pool. So it doesn't really matter how you got in. However, that isn't always the case. So starting in 2020 all of 2021, the government said, well, we really only want people who are in Canada because of the pandemic and there were travel restrictions. So we don't need to invite people under this category. We're going to concentrate on inviting people under the Canadian Experience class. And so to qualify under the Canadian Experience class, the requirement is very, very different. The work experience, first of all, is that you have worked in Canada for 1 year in the last 3 years in a high-skilled job where you are employed. You can't be self-employed by a Canadian company, and that you're not self-employed, and you can't do it while you're studying. You have a full-time student. You have to do it when you're not a full-time student. So it has to be legally. So most of the time, for example, an international student, when they graduate, then they have their work permit, then they work for a year, they could qualify under this class. Similarly, if you have a work permit under intra-company transferee, or if you have under the former NAFTA, now called CUSMA free trade agreement, we're going to talk about that. You work for a year, you would qualify under this category. The skilled trades, this is not very common. This is really most people who qualify under this would qualify under one of those other categories, except the scores sometimes are a little bit lower. They used to have draws for this once or twice a year. They haven't done so in the last couple of years, but this is for people who are in the construction trades and some cooks and chefs as well. Okay. All right. So let's say you get into the pool. Well, now we're looking at, do you have enough points to get out of the pool and get an invitation to apply? So what are the factors that matter for this? First of all, age, okay? Once you turn 30, your birthday, every time your birthday is no longer going to be a happy birthday, okay? Because every time you get 1 year older, it goes -5, -6. In your 40s, it's a fast slide, -10, -11 points. By the time you're 45, you don't have to worry about age anymore because your score will be 0 after 45. Now, compared to someone in their 20s who have scores of 110 points, right? That's a big difference because, as you know, like Express Entry is all about competition. It's like they're skimming the cream off the top. So your scores, they select people who have the highest scores, okay? And so if you are in your 40s or even in your late 30s, oftentimes we may need to look at a lot of other factors to help you boost up your points. Education is very important. Education, especially if you don't have work experience in Canada, we're looking at someone who has a master's degree, or at least a bachelor's to 3-year program of a post-secondary program plus another program, okay? Language, you guys will all have to do the English exam, even if it's your only language, and everybody has to do the IELTS or the CELPIP exams. And you'd be surprised. A lot of times people, even if it's your first language and your only language, you may not score as high as you think if you don't study. So, think about that. If you have French also, that would be a big boost, and I'll talk about that in a bit. The Canadian work experience, if you have worked in Canada, and this is the same kind of work experience I was talking about for the Canadian experience class. So if you've been working in Canada legally in a high-skilled job, and this is not when you're a student, and you're employed by a Canadian company, you can get work significant points for that. If you have high-skilled work experience outside of Canada, there are 2 levels. One is for 1-year level and one is for 3-year or more level as well. Your spouse, remember this is married or common law, their education language, Canadian work experience can add to your score a little bit. If they don't have that, it may bring down your score a little bit. So depending on whether or not you have a super spouse, your scores could vary, but it's not usually that significant, although now every point sometimes counts, but it does vary a little bit depending on your spouse. And then provincial nominee programs. So these are programs where the province has specific Express Entry linked programs. So this is not every provincial nominee program, okay? There has to be a specified provincial nominee program. And we'll talk about the Ontario one, so you get a sense of what it means. And if you get that, you get 600 points added to your score, which means that you'll be invited to apply for sure. Previous study in Canada, that will give you points. Arranged employment. So for arranged employment, it means if you have an employer-specific work permit or a LMIA, so LMIA, you get the points right away. The other, what we call IMP, International Mobility Program work permits, you have to work for 1 year, and then you can get either 200 points for executive managers or 50 points for other high-skilled occupations. And we use this a lot for entrepreneurs who are going to start their business, or people who are transferring to Canada. These points are very important. You have siblings who are Canadians or permanent residents who are living in Canada, you get some points. And if you're fluent in French, you can pass the French exam. Then you will get significant points as well. There's a trade certification as well for those in the skilled trades, construction, cooks and chefs. Okay, so let's move on to talk about the provincial nominee program in Ontario that is express entry linked. Okay. So how Ontario's express entry system works is you can't apply directly to them. You have to first be in the express entry pool and wait to receive a notification of interest from them. I don't know, do you guys know about, I think it's also in the States, I think it's this thing called Bumble, this dating app called Bumble. So as I understand it, I've never been on it because I'm too old for it, but as I understand it, how it works is a guy, if you're on the dating app, can't contact a woman directly. Okay, you can be in the pool, but you have to wait for a woman to go through it and see if they like you, and then if they like you, they send you a hello or whatever, and then you can then finally communicate with them, right? So this is the same thing with the Ontario system. You can be in the pool, but you can't contact them and say you're interested. They know you're interested. They're just in the pool, okay? And then you have to wait until you receive a notification of interest. And then if they are interested in you, then only then can you apply, okay? So who are they interested in? There are three categories. First of all, human capital stream is for people who have a bachelor's degree. And then what else? Well, the government hasn't specified exactly. They have said that they like tech people, so people in software industry. They've also said that sometimes they like other occupations. Once before they had said they like people with job offers. So it's up to the province. You kind of just put yourself into the pool and wait and see. They also look at base points levels. So just because you have a tech background doesn't mean that you're going to be invited to apply. They look at, for example, they might invite people with tech background who have a score of 460 or above, right? And then if your score is above 460 and you have a tech background, then you might be receive that notification of interest. French speakers. If you didn't know already, Canada really likes French speakers, okay? And so if you can pass the median level of French and you have your bachelor's degree, then you may be invited to apply through this category. Or else, I mean, you may have already enough points through express entry because you have French speaking. I'm going to tell you one more thing afterwards about work permits as well. So if you speak French or you know someone who has speak French, it's a good thing. Skilled trades. This is for people who are working in Ontario in the construction trades. And so if you are in Ontario, you have your valid work permit and you work for 1 year, and then in the trades, construction trades, then you could also receive a notification of interest. Okay. All right. So now I'm going to stop talking about express entry. What I'm going to talk about now is another program for the Ontario Provincial Nominee Program, but it's for non-express entry streams. So it has nothing to do with express entry. Okay. So Ontario also has another pool that people who are interested will have to go through that pool and wait to be selected. But the points are very different in the allocations. First of all, they don't care about age, which I really like. They don't care about, for certain categories, they don't care about education. They only care about work experience. For certain occupations, they do. So it just depends on, what it is that you're applying, because every stream has its own different pool, okay? The draws just happen randomly throughout the year. There's no, for example, the federal program, normally it's every 2 weeks they have a draw. For the Ontario program, they just do it whatever. Sometimes it's, it doesn't happen for a few months. Sometimes it happens after a couple of weeks. So, but there's no announcement beforehand. You just have to be in the pool. So what are the different programs for OIMP? The one that Ontario it has a priority on for the most part is the employer-based one. So you have to have a job offer in Ontario in order to qualify. If you're in the Greater Toronto area, the employers inside the Greater Toronto area, they have to meet the criteria of having a gross income of over $1 million, have 5 full-time Canadian permanent resident employees, and be in business for 3 years. If it's outside of the GTA, the gross income is $500,000, have 3 full-time Canadian permanent resident employees, and be in business for 3 years. You have to have a full-time and permanent job with the employer. Now, if you graduated from a 2-year program in Canada or a 1-year post-graduation program. So postgraduate programs are programs which require people to have a degree from a public university before they can actually undertake the program. So if you're graduate from one of these programs, then you don't need any work experience in the occupation. As long as your job offer is high skilled and you meet entry wage, then you can apply. If you're a skilled worker, if you don't qualify for this, but you're just a worker and your job is high skilled and your salary meets the median wage. So for the international student, the salary is the entry wage. For skilled worker, it has to meet the median wage, and you have 2 years of work experience in the last 5 years in the occupation. This could be anywhere in the world. You could have had this experience in, for example, let's say you are an engineer and you come to Canada, you have a job in Canada, and you have 2 years of work experience in the States. Well, we can apply for you under this category right away. Okay. Finally, there are the lower skilled, and this is one of the only lower skilled programs. These are specified for people who are truck drivers, for example, or sometimes people working in manufacturing, certain different kinds of jobs. And if they're personal support workers, nurses, aides, and you have 9 months of work experience in Ontario, and it meets the occupation is on the list, then you can also apply for permanent residence. Now, comparing this program to Express Entry, this program is longer. Normally takes around, let's say around 1.5 to 2 years to get your permanent residence. And you have to work for the employer until you get your permanent residence. Express Entry can be shorter, 6 months for processing time, but you actually have to get the invitation to apply. So we often look at a person's situation and say, okay, well, we'll advise on what is the best route to go through. Okay, so let's sort of shift gears a little bit and talk about work permits. As Americans, you guys are quite lucky in the sense that for a few things. One, a lot of American companies have Canadian subsidiaries or Canadian offices in Canada. And if they do, and if your employer is willing to transfer you to Canada, we can get you a work permit quite easily. As long as you're in a job where either you're senior management or if you have specialized knowledge. We apply through the intercompany transferee category. And if you're Americans, we just simply give you a package and you go to the airport and you get your work permit there. So this is an example of a work permit. I found this online. It's not any of my clients, but this is essentially you get this colorful piece of paper and you can, work in Canada. Now, this is something where you can only work for your specified employer. It's not an open work permit. But because it's intercompany transferee work permit, you'll get 50 points for Express Entry for arranged employment after working in Canada for a year. The other nice thing about getting work permits as an American is there is the CUSMA, the former NAFTA free trade agreement, which allows professionals under certain listed occupations to apply for permanent residence, apply for work permits in Canada if you have a job offer to work in those professions. So for example, if you were an engineer or you are a management consultant or something like computer system analyst, etc., there's a whole list of professionals. If you have a job offer in Canada, we can just give you that package. You can apply at the airport. The post-graduation work permit is for those you don't have a job offer yet. So then you study in Canada, and when you graduate, you can get your open work permit when you graduate. Now, spouses. So if you are married to someone who has a work permit and they are working in a high-skilled position, then you can work. And it's married or common law, then you can get a open spousal work permit as well. You can work anywhere you like. Now, if you don't qualify under any of the above, then we may need to resort to a labor market impact assessment, which means that you have to, the employer has to, they have to show they can't find a Canadian to do the job, so they have to advertise and then apply to the government to show that there's a labor market shortage for the position. There's a subsidiary of the labor market impact assessment called the Global Talent Stream, and this is for tech workers or companies that have innovation in them. And we can bypass a recruitment requirement where they don't have to show they can't find a Canadian to do the job, but they have to show that there are labor market benefits where they're going to hire Canadians, they're going to train Canadians, etc. That's the company. Okay. I said I was going to talk about French speakers. If you are a French speaker and you have a high-skilled job offer anywhere outside of Quebec in Canada, so we don't have anything to do with Quebec. We have a job offer, high-skilled job offer anywhere else in Canada. The job doesn't need to require you to speak any French. It just has to be high-skilled. Then we can get you a work permit. And then for entrepreneurs, if you're starting a new business, and you can show that you can run the business and it's going to have benefits to Canada, then we can apply for a work permit for you under the entrepreneur work permit category. For intra-company, for people who still have their companies back who are in the States and you're going to continue to run that business, then you can also apply for another work permit as well. Through the intra-company transferring work permit if you're going to open up a related business in Canada. All right. That's it for the immigration part. And I just wanted to show you some of the non-resident sales tax. So when we talk about, coming to Canada, if you wanted to buy a house, permanent residence often will be very important in deciding whether not having to pay for taxes that you might have to pay for as a non-permanent resident. So I'm just listing 5 different kinds of non-resident taxes, and each of these have very different requirements. So the federal programs, I don't believe, check with your real estate lawyer, but I don't believe they're in place yet. They were in the budget, and I think they're going to be in place soon, but I don't believe they're in place yet. The Ontario non-resident speculation tax, we call NRST, that one is for people who want to live in the Golden Horseshoe area, so everywhere in Toronto all the way down to Niagara. And if you are a permanent resident, citizen, or someone who is nominated under the provincial nominee program, you don't have to pay this tax. But for other people, you do have to pay this tax, but you do get a rebate if you become a permanent resident. I think it's within 4 years, I believe. But ask your real estate lawyer about that. The BC has similar to Ontario. I'm not sure if they have a rebate. I think it's you have to be a permanent resident, but double check with that. All these laws tend to change. You have to check with your real estate lawyer before you buy the property as to whether or not you have to pay the tax. Nova Scotia has one that is for even Canadians. If you're not going to live in Nova Scotia, then you have to pay these taxes. So they don't, it's not even about your immigration status. It's about whether or not you're going to live in Nova Scotia or not, I think. But again, double check with your real estate lawyer and about, when you might be able to get a rebate, whether or not you can get a rebate, and what status you need to have when you want to buy a house. All right, Otto, I'm tired of talking. Let's just talk about some of these other, I've told you a lot of information. Both Otto and I have, gone through so much today. What should you do next? Okay.
Liz, before we get into that, there's just one question that I thought we would answer live.
Sure.
The other ones we've answered, but it's a really great question, and it's one that I'm getting really often from my American clients right now. And it all has to do with this new wonderful world of remote work. So you had explained, when you're entering the Canadian workforce and can you work for an American company? But the question here is, if I get a remote work job offer for a Canadian company, do I have to live in that province where my employer is located, or can I go anywhere in Canada? Can I move around?
So it really depends on the conditions of your work permit and your plan for getting permanent residence. So, your work permit, if it allows you to work, elsewhere, then you're allowed to work elsewhere. Okay. Now, should you work elsewhere? That's a question of your immigration goals. So let's say you want to be nominated under a provincial nominee program, and the provincial nominee program is for where your employer is likely located. Well, in that case, then you should reside in that location until you get your permanent residence, because otherwise you probably, they may say that you're not eligible for it. On the other hand, so it really depends. If it's a federal program and you don't want to go to Quebec, don't live in Quebec, right? Live somewhere else. Even if your employer is in Quebec, if you live outside of Quebec, then you can show that, you plan to live outside of Quebec after you get permanent residence. So, all right. So that kind of reiterates what I've wanted to talk about first, is you got to have a plan. You can't just think, okay, I might be able to do this, I might be able to do that. You have to know for sure what is available out there. And even when we have consultations with people, we don't just have one plan. We have plan A, plan B, plan C, because the immigration system does change a lot. And you really have to see, okay, if this thing doesn't happen, what else can we do as a backup? And then after that, you really need to, once you figure it out, you just have to get it done, basically. I mean, it's common sense, but, for example, you may have to study. So you have to, okay, I might make a decision. Am I going to do this or am I not? You may have to study for your English exam. I'm not kidding when I have a lot of people whose first language and only language is the English or French, and they just don't get it because they're not unprepared for it. They're not studying. So you gotta carry out that plan. Just get it done. Okay.
Okay, this is my area because I get files when they get messy. So the best advice also that we can give is, have counsel on you. People make inadvertent errors often on applications. And Canada is extremely unforgiving. It's not an excuse in Canada to just say I didn't know the law or I didn't understand the question. if there is something wrong on an application, they can ding you for something called misrepresentation. And basically that is technically by law a 5-year ban on coming to Canada, but it can essentially be affect all other applications that you submit to Canada afterwards. So it's very dangerous to get a misrepresentation finding. So make sure that you're getting proper counsel on all of these applications. And the other thing, I was talking about it in one of the answers to the questions, is make sure you're always maintaining your status. People just take it for granted because America and Canada are so close that they're fine, that they don't really need to worry about it. But it's very critical that even when you're waiting for a permanent residence application to come through, that your temporary status is always good. And so often what I do tell people is literally that old school, get out a calendar, circle in red the day that your status expires, and make sure that your applications are in well before then to ensure that you do stay in status. And sometimes if applications are rejected, there are things that we can do. And it's very critical to be contacting a lawyer if there is a rejection, if there's a rejection at the border, if there's a rejection, in paper, even on permanent residence applications. But lawyers do need time, and we have to work quick. So often if it's a decision that's made within Canada, we only have 15 days to file to the court. If it's a decision that's made outside of Canada, then we do have 60 days, but it's still really important to be working fast because often we can get these things resolved in the 60 days if we have some time. We sometimes will ask for immigration to reconsider an application. It's rare and they can only often do it once. But this is often just done in cases where the error is so blatant that we can kind of fix it even before going to court.
And I just wanted to add here that, a lot of times people call centers because they think people are your friend at call centers. And, they think, oh, well, these people are so nice. Canadians are nice. And these officers that represent Canada are nice. And they tell me what to do. Then I'll follow it and everything will be fine. That is not the case, okay? The call center, the people there, they can give you, first of all, whatever you tell them can go back into your file, okay? And don't think that they represent the government. They do not represent you. And oftentimes when people call them, they're not officers. They're just call center agents. They're not properly trained in law. And you call them 3 times, they can give you 3 different kinds of advice. And you follow any of their advice to your detriment, that's your own problem. They don't care. Okay?
Yeah, the information is often wrong. And to Liz's point, also websites, the Canadian government websites for immigration often give wrong information. That is not in line with the law. So be very careful on the information that you're using. The websites are not clear. They're some of the worst written websites I have ever seen in my life. And sometimes they're just blatantly wrong on information.
You can contact I think they had an experiment where they had the top immigration officials to navigate the website and try to find the information on questions, and they couldn't do it. But one of the things, the call center, if you call the call center and they will likely say, okay, you let me know what it is and I will send a note to immigration. Well, first of all, you don't know what they're sending, or they'll tell you, you go and send a note through the web form or whatnot. And if you don't know what you're sending, and then they say they reject it, you come to us and you say, oh, this is the situation. Can you explain to immigration? If you've already filed it, or if the immigration office, the call center already filed it, we can't file another reconsideration. They won't look at anything that we submit again, because you only get one kick at the can.
Yeah, and a reconsideration is not a formal application, so you're already in deep water once you're doing a reconsideration. And then the last issue is if you do fall out of status, or you realize that you've fallen out of status, if you come to us early enough, basically within 90 days of it, we can file to restore your status. However, it is not the preferred way of doing things. And technically, even when you do restore a status, you don't gain status in Canada during that time period. So it is playing with fire a little bit. It is possible, but it is playing with fire a little bit. So we always, always, always try to ensure that all of our clients maintain and are very aware of when their temporary residence is going to run out. And if for some reason you have found out that it has run out, it's critical to inform us as fast as possible. Don't just wait around. Don't think it's going to fix itself. Don't think you can, get a hold of the call center or write something to immigration and wait for their response. The moment you realize something has happened, you have got to let somebody know right away, because after that, there's very little ways to fix it. So it's very critical that you let us know as fast as possible.
Yeah, contact a lawyer. Don't contact any consultants or anyone else. Only a lawyer. We can go to federal court. We understand the law. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Cool.
Oh, sorry. Ado, you have something else?
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that that kind of wraps up our presentation. I
Oh,
know
but
there was.
let's,
Oh,
yeah, let's go through some of these questions though before we wrap up.
oh,
Good.
I answered most of them on already to the individuals on it. There's one remaining question. If there's a specific study tool that you recommend for language exams.
So we there isn't particular, but on the IELTS website, there are study aids that you can have where you can take the practice exams, and they also mark it for you. So you can do it online and they'll mark it for you from the examiners. That's the one that I often recommend people to go to, because it's one thing to, I'm sure you guys know the language. The thing with these exams is they test whether or not you can write their exams and do their exams. So that's something that I wanted to do.
I think it's also worth mentioning that Americans tend to prefer the CELPIP over the IELTS. The IELTS is British English, and often, especially for the listening, it can be in a British accent. And I find the CELPIP is the Canadian or North American accent, and I find Americans tend to do better on the CELPIP. So it's CELPIP. It's worth looking at that as an option if you are having issues on the language exams.
Yeah, they may or may not have as many testing centers for CELPIP in the States.
Yeah, they do have them, but yeah, it's not as many.
Yeah. I just wanted to maybe just discuss some of these questions that were posed.
Sure.
So one person has said they are staying in Canada temporarily for 6 months, and they were advised that they can continue to do this nearly indefinitely while the application process is underway. That is their plan. How long is this sustainable? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is kind of what we're getting at in terms of, and like I said, I think at that moment you were actually talking about maintaining your temporary residence status. It's really, really, really critical. Just because you have an application in process doesn't mean you're allowed to stay here forever. It kind of depends on what application you've applied for. There is, certain applications, and that's why I asked this person, what did you apply for? Because in certain applications, if you're waiting for a decision, then you're allowed to stay while you're waiting for that decision. But if you leave Canada during that time period, you lose that status. So it's kind of, you're stuck here. And that's called implied status, which you had explained in your presentation. But a permanent residence application often doesn't let you stay here. So it's very critical that you know what applications that you have applied for and whether they give you implied status or not.
So I think this person wants to just stay here as a visitor forever. And here's the problem. Here's the problem. Okay. You're not allowed to. So every time you want to file an extension, the officer, it's not an automatic thing that the officer grants it to you. The officer is going to want a reason for why you want to stay here for a longer period than 6 months. Because one of the laws under the Immigration Act is you are not supposed to be in Canada on a permanent basis without a permanent resident visa. So one thing is, if you're filing extensions 2, 3, 4, 5 times, an officer, they might grant it to you once if you have a good reason to stay. But a longer period of time, especially if you don't even have any other permanent resident applications outstanding, a visa officer is going to look at it and say, no, I don't think this person has good reason to be in Canada, and they'll reject your application. And once your application is rejected, then you won't have status in Canada anymore, and you'll have to leave Canada. Now, you leave Canada, you say, well, I can always come back. 'Cause in America, I don't need a visa. So you want to come back. Now at the border, the officers are going to say, well, what are you doing in Canada all the time? Why are you always in Canada? So it's not a plan to be in Canada indefinitely as a visitor. You have to have a plan as to A, how you're going to get permanent residence, and B, if you wanted to work in Canada, for example, I mean, you might be able to do remote work outside of Canada, but if you wanted to, work in Canada for a Canadian employer, you should be looking to get a work permit in the short term.
Yeah, a visitor is just that. It's a visitor to Canada. So don't get it confused.
Temporary.
Yeah. And I think a new question just came in, Liz.
Yeah.
Can a spouse work if someone is in Canada on a student visa?
Yes, so that's a very good question. And the answer is if you're a student and you're going to public university or college, I'm not trying to diss the private colleges, but really you don't get a lot of benefit with those. But in the public college, then you can get a work permit as a spouse, common law or married. And so then you get an open work permit, you can work as long as you want. Now, when your spouse graduates, because your work permit is going to be as issued for the length of time as your study permit. So their work permit is going to be issued for the length of time as your study permit. And when you graduate, you can apply for postgrad work permit. In order for your spouse to extend their work permit, you have to have a high skilled job in order for them to extend their work permit more.
And another interesting thing that I would add to that is often what will happen is while they're in school, if their spouse has a work permit, the spouse starts working in Canada and is starting to rack up those express entry points that Liz was talking about. So, they get points for Canadian work experience, which is a huge slew of points at the end of a thing. So we often call this the anchor student, where the student's going to school, keeping everybody status, while the other one is hard away at work, getting those express entry points. And, that's one way that people will often get into Canada even before their partner graduates.
Yeah, you work as a team together. Okay, so one question that I wanted to discuss was this person asked, how do you get job offers in Canada if you don't have a work permit? Is there a way to locate employers who are sponsoring work permits? So I just wanted to talk about the sponsoring work permits. In US, you have something called, sponsorship for work permits. In Canada, there's no such thing as an employer sponsoring a work permit. The employer can offer you a job offer, and depending on the way that you qualify for the work permit, then you would be able to apply for the work permit. The thing is that in my experience, unless you are someone who is very, very specialized, for example, you are a specialized IT worker and they're really hunting for people with your skills and just can't find someone in Canada, they really need it. I often find that employers are not really willing to go and apply for an LMIA, where they have to show they can't find a Canadian to do the job for someone who doesn't have a work permit already. There may be other, things like if you qualify under one of the professions for the free trade agreement, or you're transferred from your company to subsidiary company in Canada, That's why I talked about the work permits. You may be able to do that. Otherwise, studying is a really nice thing to have. Once you have that work permit when you graduate, then you are so much more attractive in the job market, because when the employer asks you, can you start working? Your answer is yes, not, well, if you applied for LMIA, then I can do it. Okay. So it's about planning, and let us know if you want to, contact us, and Jessica can also help to arrange for, a consultation. Our information is here, and let's do a plan for you guys. Okay.
Thank you so much. That was excellent. That was so informative. I just want to clarify one thing really quick, and then definitely, I know we've taken up quite a lot of time answering questions. When we talk about, I think the student visa looks like a really great little cheat code. I like the anchor student. I'm definitely going to use that to explain that to my clients too. If you have kids, can we assume that the kids can go to public school as long as the student is studying and the other parent is working? The kids can
Yes,
go to school in like a public school.
Yes, absolutely. So the kids can go to grade school up to grade 12 for public schools without paying student fees if you have a study permit or work permit. And also your entire family, if you have a work permit, then your family gets the healthcare, the public healthcare as well.
Yeah, that's the big question we always get, access to the Canadian healthcare system.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's the ding
That
ding
whole
ding.
thing.
That's why we're going there. Yeah, don't leave that out because we're like an hour and a half into this and we're just talking about healthcare. No, that's good. That's good. Thank you. No, that's really great. And then when the student, when their kids are maybe 15 or 16, do they also have the right to work? Just to
no. Well, they'll have to qualify for work permit on their own. One of the things I didn't get into is this program called SWAP, which is for students who are American students, and then you can actually get a work permit to work in Canada as well. But other than that, for young people, if they go to school, you can work part-time off campus 20 hours while you're studying, and summer breaks but you have to pay the international student fees unless you get permanent residence first. So their kids can get permanent residence up to the age of 22. That's when they stop being a dependent child. So if you apply before the age of 22 for permanent residence, then your entire family gets permanent residence.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you again to both of you. Thank you so much for all this information, and to everyone watching who's watching this in the replay. Please reach directly out to this team who will help you. If you're more than welcome to come through me first, but I think we have a great team here who's going to help us relocate to Canada.
For sure.
Thanks,
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye.